You are listening to Love Bits, Episode 2, Klutzy. The skyscraper rose like a silver blade into the crisp Chicago sky, its mirrored base casting fractured beams of sunlight onto the plaza below. Fountains hissed in steady arcs, the water catching wind that whistled between the massive stone pillars. The morning air was a cocktail of roasted coffee drifting from nearby carts, hot asphalt just warming under the autumn sun, and the faint perfume of hurried office workers brushing past one another. Wendy Rhymes darted along the perimeter, her emerald coat, a creation from her own fall collection, swishing with each sharp step of her heels. Her portfolio weighed down her bag, stuffed with sketches, notes, and sales projections she had rehearsed into the early hours of dawn. This brunch with her partners wasn't just a social gathering, it was a proving ground. For years she had fought the subtle, dismissive notion that she was merely a creative, someone who dreamed up beautiful gowns but wasn't equipped to command boardrooms or steer strategy. Today was her chance to silence that doubt. "Head high, Wendy. Don't let them see the nerves." She caught her reflection in the glass wall of a bank, pausing just long enough to press her lips together and check the lipstick, her talisman against unraveling. Perfect red. No cracks. Ross Merlin circled the opposite side of the building, his navy pinstriped suit clinging to his long frame, his leather briefcase slapping against his thigh. He muttered lines under his breath, revising, rehearsing. "Our brand is not just the product, but the promise." No, too stiff. "The message is meaning." No, worse. "Come on, Ross. Tighten it. Land it." This meeting with Dean Bradley was the moment he had been waiting for, his chance to shift from mid-level consultant into someone trusted with million-dollar accounts. His pulse thrummed in his ears. Don't stumble. Don't mess this up. Not today. Neither saw the other rounding the corner. The collision erupted in chaos. Papers burst into the air like startled pigeons, Wendy's perfume colliding with Ross's aftershave. Their briefcases cracked together, flipping open, portfolios spraying receipts and fountain pens across the pavement. The impact spun them both off balance, limbs flailing as though caught in a cartoon. A beat of weightless suspension, then gravity yanked them down. Ross struck first, the breath whooshing from his lungs. Wendy landed atop him, skirt askew, her palm pressed to the center of his chest. Their faces hovered inches apart, eyes wide, lips parted in shock. For one scandalous instant, it looked less like an accident and more like a public tryst on the sidewalk. Ross blinked, dazed, his voice sheepish and embarrassed yet tinged with amusement. "I'm Ross." Wendy's laugh bubbled out, breathless, covering her nerves with wit. "I don't usually do this on a first meeting." Their laughter rang too loud, spilling relief into the morning air. Passers-by turned heads, some chuckling, others shaking their own in envy or disapproval. They scrambled upright, knees scuffed, coats disheveled. Wendy's papers fluttered in the breeze, Ross's receipts scattered like autumn leaves. Each time they bent to gather something, their fingers brushed. Each brush sparked an involuntary jolt, forcing a quick, awkward retreat. "Looks like we've both lost things," Ross muttered, eyes lowered, trying not to linger on the curve of her smile. "And some dignity," Wendy countered, slipping sketches back into her bag. They managed to corral their belongings, then headed for the stairs together. The security guard at the door smirked knowingly as they approached, shaking his head as if he had seen this comedy before. Halfway up, Wendy's heel betrayed her. It caught on the lip of the stone step, pitching her forward with a startled gasp. Ross grabbed her elbow, but the sudden momentum yanked him down too. He dropped hard to one knee before her, their faces locking again. From across the plaza, to anyone who bothered to look, it resembled a public proposal. Her cheeks burned crimson. She bent slightly toward him, voice shy but laced with humor. "Wow, this has never happened to me before. Are you okay?" Ross rubbed his knee with a wry grin, chuckling nervously, though secretly charmed by her blush. "Second collision in 10 minutes. We're breaking records." They both laughed, then hurried the rest of the way up, eyes darting everywhere but at each other. The lobby swallowed them in polished marble and the rich aroma of espresso from the kiosk tucked beside the revolving doors. The elevator's mirrored doors gleamed, reflecting their disheveled forms back at them, overlapping until it looked like two faces fused into one. Neither spoke as the elevator hummed upward. Ross pressed the button for the fourth floor. Wendy reached for the top. The ride was a slow ascension in silence, broken only by the ding of each passing number. When the doors opened at the fourth, Ross stepped out. He gave her a small nod, his voice pitched low, attempting casual though shaded with disappointment. "Good luck upstairs." Her smile was gentle, thoughtful, as she pressed herself back against the mirrored wall. "You too." The doors slid shut, sealing him out of her view. Ross stepped into the fourth-floor hallway, rolling his shoulders to reset. The meeting room was just ahead, glass walls revealing a long table where Dean Bradley already sat, flipping through a folder. Dean's reputation preceded him, razor-sharp, impatient, impossible to fool. Ross swallowed hard, smoothed his tie, and forced his stride into confidence. "Mr. Merlin," Dean said, rising to shake his hand. His grip was firm, eyes assessing. "Glad you're here. Let's finalize this." They spoke briefly about campaign metrics, cost models, the promises of engagement percentages. Ross felt steady enough until Dean closed the folder and leaned back, expression unreadable. "Before we sign off," Dean said, voice clipped, "I'll need to see some identification, standard protocol." "Of course." Ross tugged out his wallet, barely glancing as he handed over the card. Dean frowned, stared at it longer than necessary, then slowly slid it back across the table. "Is there something I should know?" Ross blinked. "Excuse me?" Dean turned the ID around. Bold letters glared back. Wendy Rhymes. Blood surged to Ross's face. He grabbed the card, flipping frantically through his wallet. Receipts, business cards, cash folded neatly, but no ID of his own. Realization crashed into him like a second collision. The sidewalk, the scramble, the wallets. "Oh, God," Ross stammered, panic curling through his voice. That's not mine. I must have—" Dean arched a brow. "You must have what?" His tone sliced. Ross exhaled, fighting to steady himself. "I had an accident outside the building. Someone else's ID must have swapped with mine." Dean's gaze was cool, skeptical, but after a tense silence, he waved a hand. "Sort it out. You have until tomorrow to get me the right documentation. We'll pause here." Ross nodded stiffly, gathered his folder, and excused himself with his pride stinging. Of all mornings, it had to be today. High above, Wendy's brunch stretched across a rooftop terrace. Linen-draped tables gleamed, sunlight bouncing off crystal glasses and polished cutlery. Waiters moved with choreographed grace, setting down silver pots of coffee and plates of flaky croissants dusted with powdered sugar. Wendy sat among her partners, their chatter flowing around her like a current she was determined to swim against. She smiled, laughed at the right cues, but inside she measured every word, every opportunity to prove her seriousness. When the waiter approached to take drink orders, she lifted her chin and said, "Irish coffee, please. Bailey's." A small indulgence, meant to signal confidence. "Certainly, ma'am. May I see your ID?" "Of course." She slipped her wallet from her bag, passing it smoothly. The waiter hesitated, his brow furrowed. He glanced again before returning it carefully. "I'm sorry, but this says Ross Merlin." Wendy's heart tripped, then laughter bubbled from her lips, too loud, too startled to contain. "Oh no, not again." Her partners turned toward her, brows arched in curiosity. She waved a manicured hand as though dismissing a joke, but her pulse skittered. That man downstairs? It has to be him. The lobby shimmered with marble and the faint fragrance of espresso beans. Wendy swept in, her heels tapping briskly across the floor. At the same moment, Ross rounded the opposite corner, clutching her emerald green wallet. Their eyes met. Recognition flared, followed quickly by embarrassment. "There you are!" Wendy exclaimed, voice bright with relief and exasperation. Ross lifted her wallet with a rueful grin. "I think we've swapped more than hellos today." They stepped toward each other, both eager to fix the mistake, but the polished floor betrayed them. Wendy's heel slipped. Ross lunged to steady her. Their momentum collided once more, sending them both sprawling to the floor in an untidy heap of coats, bags, and laughter that drew curious stares from passers-by. Papers skidded across marble. They bent at the same time, foreheads colliding with a sharp thunk. "Ow!" Wendy winced, pressing a hand to her brow. Ross leaned in instinctively, voice soft, filled with concern. "Are you okay? Let me see." His fingertips brushed close to her temple, but didn't touch. Their eyes locked. For a fleeting instant, the lobby's bustle faded. There was only his earnest gaze, her quickened breath. Wendy's voice dropped to a whisper, caught off guard by his tenderness. "No, it was my fault." Ross lingered, torn between instinct and insecurity. Then the thought stabbed him. She's out of my league. She deserves better than this mess of a morning. He pulled back, straightened his jacket, and forced a polite smile. "Well," he said lightly, turning to leave. "Good day." Something in Wendy snapped. Watching him walk away, shoulders stiff, she felt a surge of boldness she hadn't planned. Her voice rang out across the lobby, sharp but threaded with hope. "Hey, that's it? You're just going to leave and not ask me out?" The room seemed to still. Ross froze mid-step. Slowly he turned, astonishment flashing across his face. She walked toward him, chin high, daring him to refuse. Ross's lips curved into a smile, slow and incredulous. His voice, when it came, was low and edged with relief. "Well, I was hoping you'd say that." Their first dates unfolded like outtakes from a comedy reel. At a small Italian restaurant, candlelight flickered against brick walls. Violins hummed from a stereo overhead. Wendy gestured too broadly while speaking, her wrist brushing her glass. Red wine cascaded across the white tablecloth, the stain blooming like a violent Rorschach blot. Ross reached quickly for napkins, laughter tumbling from his chest. "We'll call it modern art." Wendy pressed her hands to her face, half mortified, half giggling. "Only if the critics are forgiving." At a movie theater, nestled in velvet seats, their hands met in the popcorn bucket. Instead of brushing past politely, both clutched at once. The bucket jerked, kernels scattering like confetti into the row behind them. A voice hissed, "Hey!" But Wendy buried her face into her scarf, stifling laughter. Ross leaned close, whispering in a conspiratorial murmur. "Smooth, huh?" Wendy peeked up, cheeks burning, whispering back, "Smooth as sandpaper." On Navy Pier, bundled against a biting lake wind, Wendy sneezed at the exact moment Ross turned toward her. Her shoulder bumped him squarely into a hot dog vendor's cart. Condiments rattled, ketchup bottles toppled, mustard smeared across his sleeve. Ross blinked at the yellow streak, then laughed so hard he doubled over. "Why are you laughing?" Wendy groaned, trying to clean him with napkins. His voice was warm, forgiving. "Because if I don't laugh, I'll cry." Each mishap became part of their private language, a series of accidents that exposed them without pretense. When Ross stumbled over words, "You're the pest, best," Wendy laughed until tears streaked her mascara. When she mispronounced his name as Moss Relrin, he nearly choked on his drink. Vulnerability disguised as comedy drew them closer than polished small talk ever could. Nights bled into weeks until Wendy invited him to her consortium's ball. The evening glittered like a fairy tale staged in gold. Chandeliers dripped crystals that refracted warm light onto marble floors. A string quartet played softly at the edge of the room, while servers circulated with champagne flutes. Perfume and cologne tangled in the air. Gowns shimmered like waterfalls of silk. Tuxedos cut black lines against the golden glow. Wendy glided across the floor in a silver gown she had designed herself. Every stitch whispered of triumph, yet inside, nerves pulsed. Don't let them think you've brought someone who doesn't belong. She looked at Ross beside her, steady in his dark suit, and prayed he felt at ease. Ross felt anything but. He tugged at his cufflinks, conscious of every polished glance in his direction. Yet when Wendy's hand brushed his, warmth steadied him. He could endure anything if she smiled like that. The quartet shifted suddenly into tango. Wendy turned, startled. "You dance?" Ross's grin was sly, voice pitched low. "Try me." They stepped into the center as the crowd parted. The violins struck like a match. Bandoneon sighed. A drum whispered the promise of danger. Ross slid his palm along Wendy's back until it found the anchor beneath her shoulder blade. She set her hand in his with the trust of someone poised at a cliff's edge and willing the leap to feel like flying. Their first step landed clean, the second cleaner, and the room exhaled with them, as if everyone sensed a current had snapped taut and begun to sing. He led. She answered. Their feet conversed in accents of leather and silk. The Klutzy curse, the small chaos that had trailed them like a naughty child, loosened its grip the way fog lifts from a lake when sun insists. Her breath brushed his cheek as he drew her through a slow ocho, the world sliding to a smear of gold light and shadow. He heard crystal clink, a scattered whisper, "Who are they?" And then only the crisp consonants of their steps. He pivoted. She spiraled. His frame held, her spine arched like a bow in the hands of a sure archer. The floor had never been so patient. The ceiling had never hung so close. "Don't think," Ross told himself as he threaded her through a gancho and felt the precise tap of her calf against his thigh. "Just listen." He listened to the rise of the violins, to the warm rasp of the bandoneon, to the subtle shift of her breath that meant, "Turn now. Turn tighter. Trust me." Wendy felt the architecture of the ballroom reassemble around them, chandeliers falling like frozen fireworks, shadowed faces rinsed in gold, the marble deepening to a riverbed underfoot. She registered the astonishment in her partner's eyes and felt a small, stubborn pride flicker. "I belong here," it said, "not because I'm flawless, but because I'm true." She let that certainty travel through her hand into Ross's and felt the certainty answer back. A circle formed. The quartet's rhythm pressed, then retreated. He curved her into a tight moulinette around him. She traced his waist with precise burning arcs, skirt flaring just enough to make the air flicker. Their bodies were grammar, posture was syntax, pauses were commas. They wrote a sentence the room could read without translation. Two people who were clumsy at almost everything except holding each other upright. A waiter stopped mid-stride. The hired dancers, leaning in a shadowed doorway, stilled as if a gust had pinned them there. Somewhere near the back, a glass breathed a bright ping, as if it too had an opinion. Ross dipped her. The glittered weight of the room fell with her until his hand caught it. Her hair spilled like night down a white marble waterfall. He could have counted each lash if he weren't occupied with the fact that his own heart had just performed a reckless, perfectly timed bolio inside his chest. His voice, a breath of awe barely louder than the music. Perfect. Her voice, a smile threaded with wonder. "Don't jinx it." They rose together on a long phrase, the kind that feels like doors opening in opposite wings of a house at the same time. He drew her in close. The pivot turned into a glide that turned into a glide that turned into a stop so balanced the air itself leaned forward to see how. When the final chord pressed its mouth to silence, their bodies were already speaking the last word. Applause didn't break so much as bloom. It started in the back, two claps like small birds, then rolled forward until it was sound with shoulders and teeth. Wendy remained in his hold for one heartbeat longer than was necessary, then two, and then she was upright, and then they were bowing, and then they were laughing. the unguarded laugh of people who have just stepped through something that might change them forever. They left the floor with that laugh still on their faces. The hired dancers looked giddy rather than threatened. Someone called, "Bravo!" Another voice, sly with admiration, "Who trained you?" Their hands stayed linked, not as a statement, but as a momentum they hadn't learned how to stop. On the periphery, Wendy's partners hovered in a crescent of good jewelry and curious eyes. The one who had once referred to her as our creative flame approached with a cordial smile. Wendy felt the old flutter of being measured and felt it quiet, as if the dance had tuned her somewhere deeper than nerves could reach. His tone, polished with the ease of money and softened by genuine surprise. "Wendy, I had no idea." Her tone, light but not apologetic, buoyed with earned confidence. "Neither did I." He turned to Ross, weighing him the way men who live in rooms like this weigh other men. His tone, diplomatic, amused. "And you are?" Ross's tone, courteous with a glint of humor at the edge. "A consultant, occasionally a decent follower." A ripple of laughter gentled the scrutiny. A server glided between them with a tray of champagne, and the circle relaxed into small clusters. Glasses lifted, adjectives chosen, the evening story already beginning to write itself in a dozen versions around the room. Ross could feel the afterglow of the tango in his joints, a hum just at the hinge of every movement. Wendy took a flute. He did too. Their fingers bumped the thin neck of a glass and steadied it together. She tilted her head, studying him as if the details might flee if she blinked too long. Her voice, warm, a little breathless still, threaded with disbelief. "Where did you learn to do that?" His voice, sheepish pride that doesn't want to sound like bragging. "College. A roommate dragged me for extra credit. It stuck." He nudged her shoulder with his voice teasing with soft sincerity beneath. "You?" Her voice, a confession that feels more like the disclosure of a map. "Lessons, years ago. For shows, for fun, for the version of me that forgets what floors are for." She lifted the glass and smiled at him over the rim, her voice playful. "Thank you for finding my balance." His voice, honest as a pulse. "You found it. I just stood where it could happen." They drifted toward the edge of the ballroom, where the air was cooler and carried a hint of winter sneaking under doors. Someone introduced someone. Names bobbed and sank. A woman in jade silk asked about Wendy's gown, and learned it was Wendy's design, and then asked much more, as if the dress had slipped a coin into the slot of her curiosity. Ross watched Wendy switch between the languages of artistic joy and strategic clarity, watched a partner's appraising smile shift into something like respect. He did not step away or forward, he simply stood in the place where her light could be seen without being bossed around by it. It felt like the dance had taught his body a grammar for the rest of the evening. After a while, the crowd's temperature climbed with the champagne. Laughter brightened. The quartet shifted to a jaunty waltz. A photographer asked for a picture. They obliged. Flash. Their heads tipped together at the last second and caught a candid that made Wendy's stomach tilt. Not from worry for once, but from a sensation that had nothing to do with tripping and everything to do with arriving. They cut through to the terrace for air. The city unfurled beyond the balustrade, windows stacked like lit manuscripts, streets handwriting their sentences in headlights. The night smelled of stone and car exhaust and the faint iron tang of cold. Wendy set her glass on the rail and flexed her toes inside her shoes. Ross leaned beside her, coat open to the breeze. Below them, the fountains kept their private conversations with gravity. Wendy's voice, softer than the cold, a confession that tests itself against open air. "Sometimes I think that if I don't perform my competence perfectly, they'll loan it to me for a fee and take it back at the first stain." Ross's voice, steady, more certain for having been unsure earlier. "You danced. No one can rent that to you. You own it." She laughed and shook her head, hair skimming the sequined edge of her shoulder. Her voice, teasing to keep from tipping into tenderness too fast. "Are you always like this? Suits and sentences? Cracking jokes in emergency rooms? Finding the tempo in chaos? He thought of the morning's collisions, his ID in Dean Bradley's hand, the way shame can pull your shoulders narrower than the truth requires. He thought of how Wendy had called across a lobby and refused to let fear have the last line. His voice, wry with the humility of being seen, not always, today was not my tightest choreography. Her voice, gentled by the mercy that lives in people who have fallen a few times and chosen not to harden. Then we can be not always together. Silence then, but not empty. The city's wind turned a page. Somewhere inside, the quartet found a minor key and turned it into something brave. They returned to the ballroom because evenings like this have their tide. They danced once more, not tango this time, but something rounder, lazier, familiar enough that conversation could slip through it without tearing. They talked about food, how he burned eggs and she forgot timers, about first jobs, his hauling signage up freight elevators, hers steaming hems in a borrowed studio with one window and a stubborn radiator, about the small rituals that make a day intelligible, his coffee black, her coffee sweet, the way both of them liked to walk because walking arranged their thoughts into rows that could be harvested later. He said he loved museums and trees. She said she loved museums and the lake. They both loved the split second between a streetlight shifting and a person noticing, the small mercy of seeing a world decide and then hold still for you. They designed a future without naming it a future, just stitching maybe to someday with threads no one else could see. When they finally stepped away from the floor, a tray of champagne made a bright constellation at elbow height. Ross, buoyant with the gentleness of what the night had turned into, reached out without looking. His cuff nudged a stem. It wobbled, clinked a neighbor, set off a delicate chain of near falls that righted themselves at the last moment, a small orchestra of glass changing its mind about disaster. Ross's voice, a rueful half-laugh at his own predictability. There's the universe reminding me not to get cocky. Wendy caught the threatened flute with a quick, sure hand, her voice triumphant as if she'd plucked a comet out of a risky orbit. Not tonight. She held the glass up to him, an offering and a joke. Her voice, mock formal, to improbable stability. His voice, accepting the toast the way sailors accept stars, as guidance as much as celebration, to landing on our feet, eventually. They clinked. The sound was small and perfect. A photographer materialized again, as if conjured by that note, his tone bright with practiced enthusiasm. One more of the stars of the night? He lifted the camera. They angled their bodies. Ross placed his palm lightly at her waist, not proprietary, just present. Wendy set her hand on his chest where she had braced herself that first morning encounter, and the muscle there remembered the print of her palm. Flash. The moment folded itself for later. Later came quicker than either would have guessed. The crowd swelled. A partner beckoned Wendy to make a brief round of introductions near the head table. She glanced at Ross, apology darting through her eyes like a small fish, her voice, regretful but buoyed by duty. Give me 5 minutes? His voice easy, because loving someone's talent means loving the places it takes them. Take 10. I'll be right here. He wasn't. He drifted, half by choice, half by tide, toward a column where a waiter stood with a tray of canapes and a story, ready for anyone who looked lonely enough to need one. Ross wasn't lonely. He was lit from the inside. But he listened as the waiter told him about ballet classes and bus schedules, about how shoes have to be replaced before they confess the wear that could break you. Ross tipped too much because the story had the courage to be ordinary. When Wendy returned, she found him laughing with the waiter and felt a strange heat of gratitude bloom under her ribs. Most people perform kindness to waitstaff. Ross seemed simply to inhabit it. They wandered again, through a constellation of acquaintances, past a cluster of investors, along a perimeter where music slipped out the door to find smokers who had chosen a different kind of waltz. On a whim, Perhaps because the edges of the night felt stitched with serenity, perhaps because her confidence was a new garment and she wanted to see if it wrinkled. Wendy tugged Ross toward the small dais where remarks would be made later. She stepped up, testing the mic that wasn't on, and looked out at rows of gold-backed chairs waiting for speeches. The sight should have tightened her chest. Instead, it washed her with the same stillness she'd felt in the dip of the tango, the certainty that you can hold your own weight and someone else's gaze at the same time. Her voice, half jest, half prayer, addressed to the future. One day I'll stand up here and say something they remember. His voice, unadorned, a promise made to the air and to himself in equal measure. You will. She turned to him as if the remark had cast a light she hadn't noticed she needed. Her voice, tender with the surprise of being believed. Stay. His voice, immediate, not dramatic, the way yes should sound when yes is the truth. I'm not going anywhere. They stayed till the program resumed and most of the chairs were filled. They sat in the back row, close enough to leave when they were ready, far enough to watch without being watched. A benefactor spoke about vision. A designer spoke about craft. A CFO spoke about metrics in sentences so crisp they sounded like ice cracking on a lake. The quartet threaded music between the speeches like silk binding wounds you only notice when touched. When they rose to leave, it was late enough that the air had sharpened to a clean, insistently honest cold. The ballroom doors folded them out into a corridor polished to a patient shine. The elevator dinged. The two of them stepped in, and in the instant before the doors closed, a server hustling past clipped the silver rail with a tray. The edge of the tray nicked Wendy's shoulder. Not hard, just enough that her balance shivered, just enough that Ross reached out and steadied her by instinct, and knocked his own elbow on the panel so that the 4 lit up, and then the 10, and then, for reasons only elevators understand, the L. Wendy's voice, wincing, then laughing because the pain was nothing and the pattern was everything. Our special talent returns. Ross's voice, a smile surrendering to the inevitable with a kind of amused reverence. We were getting suspiciously good at this. The doors slid open on the lobby, all marble and late-night hush. They stepped out, and the building seemed to listen for something. Another crash, a joke, a declaration. None came. Only their footsteps and the soft swoop of a night guard's pen across a sign-in sheet. Outside, the city had set its jaw against the cold. Steam poured from a street vent like a dragon too tired to roar. Traffic whispered instead of sang. Wendy slipped her hand into the crook of Ross's arm, and they walked the slow, careful walk of people who have finally understood that grace is not the absence of falling, but the wisdom of how to rise. They paused at the curb where the plaza's fountains kept their steel-blue promises, and she looked at him as if the night had just handed her a small wrapped box, and she could already feel the shape of what was inside without opening it. Her voice, low, with the soft amazement of someone discovering that fate can be funny and faithful at once. I had fun. His voice, equal parts gratitude and fear of scaring it away with too much pressure. Me too. A cab slowed. A bus sighed. Somewhere a siren wrote its red italic through a street 3 blocks over. They didn't kiss. Not here. The choice not to felt like a craft all its own. Wendy's voice, playful to hide the quiver she couldn't quite tame. Walk me to the corner, dancer. Ross's voice, mock bowing, delighted to obey. As you wish, designer. They went. Careful and not careful, laughing under their breath when a loose flagstone challenged them, triumphant when they cleared it without incident. At the corner, she lifted a hand for a car, and the car came, and she looked at him through the bubble of her breath, and for the first time since morning, the day went still enough to set a pin in. Her voice, tender, promising more because it didn't try to promise everything. Tomorrow? His voice, joy steadying into something that might one day have another name. Tomorrow. The door closed. The car pulled away. He watched the taillights knit themselves into the red thread of a city that hadn't run out of fabric yet. In the reflection on the nearest dark window, he saw himself, the suit, the smile he wasn't posing for anymore, the man who had stumbled into luck and then chosen to earn it. He laughed once, softly. It sounded like a glass deciding not to fall. The night folded itself. The city kept breathing. Above the plaza, the mirrors of the building returned the stars to themselves, and if any passerby had looked up just then, they might have believed that everything, briefly, was both precarious and precisely where it belonged. The drizzle had begun as a whisper, just a thin veil of moisture softening the edges of Chicago's stone and glass. It left the streets shining as though they had been polished overnight. Every streetlight reflected back in streaks of amber and green. Vendors were already stoking their braziers, the roasted chestnuts sending a sweet, nutty perfume into the air. The sidewalks hummed with a Saturday energy, people moving briskly but not frantically, umbrellas bobbing, newspapers tucked under arms. Wendy and Ross strolled close together, their coats brushing. Wendy carried a paper bag cradled in her elbow, the buttery scent of croissants leaking through. Ross balanced 2 takeaway coffees, one already half empty. The mist had dampened Wendy's hair, darkening it at the edges, and Ross thought she had never looked more alive than she did at that moment, unpolished, laughing, unguarded. "See?" she teased, her voice dancing. "We can have a perfectly ordinary walk. No calamities, no pratfalls." Ross grinned, his breath clouding in the chill. "Careful, you'll tempt fate. The universe doesn't like to be mocked." But for a few blissful minutes, it seemed they had outrun the curse. The air was cool, their conversation easy, their hands brushing without resistance. Wendy's laughter tumbled out again, bright, rich, the sound of walls falling. And then it happened. Her heel slipped on a slick seam of pavement where the drizzle had pooled. She pitched sideways, shoulder slamming into Ross. The coffee flew from his hand, arcing brown against the gray sky, before splattering across the street. He windmilled, staggered, and in an instant was off the curb. The shrill bell of a bicycle split the air. "Ross!" Wendy's scream cracked like glass. The cyclist was barreling downhill, legs pumping, head down against the drizzle. He swerved, braked hard, but momentum is cruel. The bike struck Ross with a brutal crack, metal meeting flesh and bone. Ross spun, his body folding awkwardly before it crashed onto the asphalt. Cars screeched, horns erupted. The croissants flew from Wendy's grasp, tumbling to the gutter. People shouted. The cyclist skidded, curses tumbling from his lips. Wendy fell to her knees beside Ross, the wet pavement seeping cold into her stockings. His face was pale, his breath ragged, his right arm twisted at a grotesque angle beneath him. Her voice was shrill, breaking, frantic. "Oh my God, Ross, are you okay? Please, talk to me." Ross groaned, eyes squeezed shut, pain etched deep into his features. "My arm." His voice was strangled, harsh. "It's broken. Oh God, it's broken." The wail of sirens rose in the distance, growing closer. Wendy pressed his hand between hers, clutching as if she could tether him to safety. Rain mingled with tears, dripping down her face, stinging her eyes. "It's okay. They're coming," she whispered over and over, the words for herself as much as for him. "They're coming. Hold on. Just hold on." The hospital swallowed them whole in its sterile brightness. The waiting area smelled of antiseptic and despair, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Orderlies wheeled Ross past swinging doors, while Wendy trailed, numb, shoes squeaking faintly on linoleum. Hours blurred, x-rays, murmured medical jargon, the sharp scent of rubbing alcohol. At last, Ross lay propped in a hospital bed, his right arm swallowed by a fresh white cast that stretched from wrist to shoulder. Wendy sat close, hands restless. She tucked blankets around him, adjusted pillows, smoothed his hair off his forehead. She needed to help, to fix, to erase the accident she had caused. But her touch was frantic, fumbling. Ross's face was gaunt with exhaustion, eyes glazed with painkillers. He tried to reach for the television remote with his uninjured hand. Wendy leapt up at the same moment, eager to be useful, and shifted the food tray. Her elbow clipped the cast. The tray slammed into his wrist. There was a sickening crack. Ross screamed, a sound jagged enough to cut through every antiseptic wall. His finger bent at an unnatural angle, fresh pain blazing through him. Wendy gasped, hands flying to her mouth. "Oh no! Oh God, Ross, I didn't mean—" His face twisted, his voice raw, edged with anger that was part fury, part heartbreak. "Just stop! Please, Wendy, leave!" The words punched the air out of her chest. Tears welled, her throat closed. She whispered, voice splintered, trembling. "I'm so sorry, Ross." But silence answered her. Silence and the hiss of machines. She backed away, heels tapping against tile, her body shaking. At the doorway, she looked once more. His face turned from her, his shoulders tight. Then she fled, tears streaking down her cheeks, her own heart feeling as fractured as his bones. The weeks after the hospital fractured into fragments in Ross's mind. Pain blurred them at first, the ache of bone knitting inside plaster, the dull throb that returned each night despite medication. But sharper than the pain was the silence. Wendy did not come back. She did not call. She did not write. She obeyed his words, and though Ross told himself it was what he had wanted, what he had shouted in anger, each empty morning revealed the truth. He had not wanted absence. He had wanted relief. And now he had neither. 6 months later, Ross had become another man, or so people said. He wore sharper suits, darker ties. His hair, once in slight disarray from rushing between meetings, now lay immaculate. He filled boardrooms with confidence, his voice persuasive, his pitches crisp. He won accounts, he signed contracts. He received nods of respect from colleagues who had barely noticed him before. But outside the spotlight of his slides and strategies, loneliness clung to him. Hotel rooms after conferences were silent but for the hum of mini fridges. His phone lit up with notifications, but none from the name he most longed to see. He found himself laughing at things that weren't funny, the memory of red wine soaking a tablecloth, the popcorn that had rained across a theater, Wendy's hand slipping into his by accident, always by accident. He kept her ID card photo in his desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night, he opened it, traced the edge with his thumb, then shut it quickly as though caught in something shameful. Wendy's world had grown louder, brighter, more dazzling. Her designs strode down runways, her face appeared in glossy magazines. Journalists called her a visionary, a disruptor. Investors leaned in when she spoke. In public, she was luminous, but her loft at night was a cavern. Dresses lined up like soldiers in satin and velvet, mannequins frozen in eternal poses. She sewed into the early hours, fingers aching, pricking herself more often than before. Each drop of blood on fabric felt like a tiny curse. Her friends teased her about clumsiness, about how she was always spilling, stumbling, dropping. She smiled along, but inside it twisted. The curse was no longer endearing. Without Ross to laugh it into joy, it was only a reminder of loss. She kept his ID photo in her bedside drawer. She told herself it was an accident, a leftover. But sometimes she opened it just to whisper his name. When fate decided to draw its crooked line again, it chose New York. The hotel ballroom shimmered like a golden dream. Chandeliers scattered light across polished parquet floors. A jazz trio spilled warmth into the air, trumpet honeyed, bass a steady pulse, piano sharp and playful. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, offering the Manhattan skyline glittering like jewelry against the black of night. Ross entered with a woman on his arm. She was elegant, poised, her gown a column of black silk. She laughed in the right places, spoke with refined ease. He smiled when she addressed him, nodded at her remarks, but his smile was thin, his eyes restless. Wendy entered minutes later with a partner from her consortium. He was suave, charming, his hand steady at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. Wendy was resplendent in scarlet satin, her gown cut to move like liquid fire. She carried herself with the confidence of success, but inside her breath was shallow. And then they saw each other. Across the expanse of laughter and champagne, of glitter and chatter, their gazes collided. Ross's heart clenched. She looks the same. No, not the same. More. Untouchable. The world has crowned her. She doesn't need me. Wendy's chest tightened, heat flooding her throat. Don't trip. Don't let him see you falter. Not when he's watching. Not when I still want him to. They broke eye contact. Ross turned to his date, asked about her drink. Wendy leaned toward her partner, laughed too loudly at something trivial. But neither of them heard the words spoken to them. Their attention stayed tethered across the room, every motion measured by the awareness of being seen. Ross found himself drifting near the bar, his date chatting with someone else. He caught glimpses of Wendy in reflections, her laugh tossing her head back, the line of her shoulders, the way she lifted her glass. She seemed luminous, magnetic, and yet when he looked closer, he thought he saw it. The faintest tension at the corner of her mouth, the shadow of strain in her jaw. Wendy, too, stole glances. Ross's suit was immaculate, his posture commanding, his every gesture sharp. He looked successful, whole. But she recognized the hollowness in his smile, the way his eyes scanned the crowd even when his companion spoke. He seemed polished, but incomplete. She longed to cross the room. She longed to touch his arm, whisper his name, laugh away the months. But she stood still, her nails biting her palms inside her gloves. No, he told you to leave. He told you to stop. Don't humiliate yourself. Don't fall again. And so they circled each other from afar, two planets caught in gravitational pull, but refusing collision. Then the announcer introduced Ross for his keynote. He mounted the podium, the room settling into silence. Wendy's heart pounded. She forced her expression into polite attentiveness, but inside she braced, as if every word might cut. Ross cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone. His voice began polished, professional, rehearsed. "The pursuit of happiness," he said, his cadence measured. "In marketing, it's the thrill of discovery, the right product, the right promise, the right consumer." Charts glowed on screens behind him. He gestured smoothly, audience heads nodding, but then, as if a weight shifted in his chest, his tone changed, softer, slower. But discovery is the easy part. Finding something, finding someone, isn't the challenge. The real work begins after, holding it, nurturing it, forgiving it. The word hung in the air like a fragile glass orb. His eyes sought her out, found her, held her. Wendy's breath caught. Heat rose behind her eyes. The room seemed to shrink until there was only him and her, the speech and its truth. "That's where the pursuit becomes the labor of love," Ross said, voice unsteady now. "Not in perfection, but in persistence." The audience murmured approval, some dabbing at eyes. But Wendy heard only the echo of her own heart, hammering forgiveness against the walls she had built. Ross let the last sentence hang, the microphone cupping his breath. The ballroom was so quiet that the silence felt alive, a bright animal that had wandered in from the cold and curled at everyone's feet. He straightened, as if something inside him had finally aligned. "I'd like to end differently tonight," he said, voice steady, eyes still on Wendy, though his words faced the room. He turned to the trio. "Would you play the tango?" A tremor of surprise moved through the crowd. The pianist's mouth tilted into a half-smile. The bassist exchanged a quick glance with the bandoneon player, who drew his instrument open until it sighed like a held breath finally released. The first phrase rose, dusky and warm, and the air changed, as if the chandeliers had lowered themselves an inch to listen. Ross stepped down from the dais. He did not rush. He let the music choose his pace, let the decision he had already made carry his body forward. People parted in small, attentive currents. He stopped in front of Wendy. His hand emerged between them, palm up, steady. His voice was sure, but the surety trembled with hope. "Dance with me." Her partner's hand fell from the small of her back. She felt the blood leave her face, and then return, bright and full. She stood. The room blurred at the edges, as if someone had turned down the focus knob on the entire evening, except for this square of space and this man inside it. "Yes," she said, softly, but it was the kind of softness granite understands. They walked onto the floor together. The circle of guests widened. The bandoneon breathed again, and the violins struck a line of light between them. His right hand found the anchor beneath her shoulder blade. Her left found the reliable slope of his shoulder, thumb sliding into the seam where fabric meets breath. Their other hands laced with an ease that felt less like choreography and more like remembering how their own names were spelled. They moved. The first ocho unfurled like a ribbon. Her hips drew a figure 8. His axis turned to greet it. The floor was a patient lake. The chandeliers listened without flickering. A memory lifted inside the step, feather light and insistent. Papers flying like startled birds, her palm braced against his chest, their first ridiculous tangle on the sidewalk. Wendy felt it enter her body the way a laugh does, sudden, bright, impossible to refuse, and she breathed into the turn with her smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Ross felt another surface under his shoes. Stone stairs, a misjudged step, the drop to one knee as bystanders mistook calamity for proposal. The room, the band, the winter outside, all slid for a heartbeat behind that image, and then the present reasserted itself in the press of her hand and the clean, decisive weight shift of her cross. He adjusted his frame by the width of a thread. Perfection had never been the point. Contact was. They accelerated, not in speed so much as in tension. He pivoted. She quartered around him, the molinet carving tight arcs. The music wrote them forward, and they obeyed. Heat climbed her throat. A curl slipped from the smoothing of her hair and clung to her temple. He wanted to kiss that single curl. He led a gancho instead, and her calf tapped clean against his thigh, precise, electric. Red wine blooming like a Rorschach. The stain crept up in her body as a warmth that exploded now as control, her body translating embarrassment into eloquence. She turned that old spill into a pivot, so even the hired dancers leaned in as if to memorize it. Popcorn arcing into the row behind them, and they both nearly laughed mid-step at the memory of their hushed apologies and shared mischief, and he tucked her into a close embrace for 2 bars because inside that smallness, their shoulders could confess things their mouths were not ready to say. He stepped her out into space again. The scarlet of her gown flamed against the gold of the room. On the next phrase, he gave her room for an embellishment, and she drew a circle with the metal whisper of her heel. A flourish so delicate it seemed to write grace is stubborn on the floorboards. Mustard on a sleeve at Navy Pier, and his laugh then, the helpless kind, trickled through his chest now in a low answering sound that pressed the next lead into her back with a tenderness she felt down to the soles of her feet. They had been a joke and a miracle, a hazard and a hymn. The music seemed to know. Around them the crowd softened, first with surprise, then with recognition, then with something like gratitude. Couples pressed closer. Singles forgot to sip. A photographer raised his camera and then lowered it, deciding, wisely, that there are moments you steal and moments you witness. They crossed the line of dance, and the skyline beyond the windows burned like a field of embers. Wendy let her eyes close for a single beat and saw the hospital light, flat, unforgiving, and the shape of Ross's pain under it. The old shame rose, sharp and uninvited. She faltered, not in her step, but in her certainty. His hand anchored, not tight, not corrective, just there, like the words stay spoken without sound. "I'm here," his breath said against her hair. "I know," hers said back against his throat. The phrase rose. He led a slow salida that felt like a door opening, and she walked into it with the kind of trust that cannot be rushed into existence by will or want. It is earned, or it is nothing. Tonight, it was earned one weight shift at a time. The trio took the melody up into a ribbon of fire. He spun her under his arm. She surfaced on the other side with a small, involuntary laugh that tasted like the morning they had shared before the world misstepped. He kept her there, out in the bright part of the room, so everyone could see what he had been lucky enough to learn, that her strength didn't gleam because it never fell. It gleamed because it knew how to rise. They moved like a sentence finally landing on the verb it had been reaching for. His lead was a question. Her answer completed it, and then sent it somewhere braver. The curse they used to joke about, clumsy gravity with a mean sense of timing, hovered respectfully at the edge of the floor, as if even mischief knew when to tip its hat. They paused into stillness that wasn't empty, but saturated. Breath stacked above breath. The hall leaned forward with them. In the quiet pocket of that pause, both of them slipped backward in time. Her voice at the lobby. "Hey, that's it? You're just going to leave and not ask me out?" His shock, then the rush of relief, then the first step toward yes. His voice over a tray of precarious glasses. "There's the universe reminding me not to get cocky." Her quick catch, the toast to improbable stability. Their hands in popcorn, their feet at the edge of Lake Michigan, the syrupy sweetness of warm chestnuts in winter, the tiny flashlight beam of laughter they'd learned to carry through rooms that didn't always want to be kind. The bandoneon drew itself closed like a sigh that decides not to become a sob. The bass walked them carefully along the last measure. Ross set his hand a fraction lower on her back, and she answered by lengthening, not theatrically, but honestly, into his space. He felt the precise moment trust outweighs fear. It has weight. He could have measured it. "Perfect," he breathed, because he had no other word at hand. The world narrowed to the small geometry they made together. "Don't jinx it," she murmured, because superstition was the last veil, and she needed to lift it with humor or not at all. He dipped her. Not a trick dip, not a showy drop, but a hold that said, "I do not confuse danger with drama. I am learning the difference between spectacle and safety." Her hair spilled like ink over marble. She watched the ceiling stop being a ceiling and become a sky. The final chord pressed its warm mouth to silence. Then the silence broke open with applause that rolled and rolled. They rose into it, laughing, flushed. He bowed. She curtsied. They were not professionals. They were something rarer, forgiven and forgiving. He kissed her. It was not public so much as inevitable, not greedy so much as grateful. His hand splayed at her ribs. Hers found his jaw. Around them, chairs scraped and hands met, and someone who had never liked tango clapped harder than anyone else, because sometimes love makes you love the door it walked through. They left the floor together, still tethered by a smile they had not yet learned to put down. People spoke to them, words like stunning, how long, where did you train, and their answers were easy and unshowy. The hired dancers grinned and lifted invisible hats. A waitress pressed a glass of water into Wendy's hand with the kind of conspiratorial look that women exchange in rooms where everything shines. Then fate, like a child who has been very good for an hour and cannot resist one more prank, stuck its foot out. A seam in the parquet, a spoon not where a spoon should be, a patch of floor polished a bit too lovingly. Which one it was, neither of them could later say. He slid. Not a catastrophe, just a slide, enough to unspool balance from his ankle up. He grabbed Wendy, the way the body always reaches first for the thing it loves most. She tried to brace, Together they executed a graceless, perfect collapse. They went down in a heap, all elbows and laughter, her skirt a scarlet puddle, his tie attempting to strangle him with comic timing. Champagne breathed a quiet tink as a flute considered falling and then decided, in a show of solidarity, to remain upright. Wendy lay on her back, stunned into stillness for exactly one beat. Then laughter burst out of her, not a polite tinkle but the uncontrollable five-note laugh Ross had fallen for in a dozen cities and 3 seasons. Tears spilled. She didn't wipe them. "Maybe this curse is just us," she said, voice light, full, a declaration disguised as a joke. Ross propped himself on an elbow, the other hand still gripping hers as if the floor might open and select one of them for a prank without the other. He was breathless, hair crooked, grinning with all his teeth. "Then I wouldn't change a thing." They stayed there longer than etiquette recommends, because joy outranks etiquette when it has to. People around them laughed, not at them, but with them, the room relieved to learn that beauty, which had been so serious for 3 minutes, could survive a pratfall without cracking. A woman near the edge dabbed her eyes. The bandoneon player made a little ol under his breath. Someone snapped a photo and then put the phone away, deciding to keep the rest for memory. Wendy rolled onto her side to face him. The polished floor reflected them in a blur, 2 figures made soft by a sheen of light. "You asked for forgiveness," she said, the words barely louder than her smile. "I did," he said. His voice caught, surprised to find itself so close to breaking and not minding. "I need yours, and I need to give mine." Her palm found his cheek. "Then we're even, and also endless." He laughed, and the laugh carried a tremor of something like awe. The waiter from earlier, the one with the tray who had been careful in the way of men who know the cost of shoes, crouched near them, offering a hand. "Shall we try standing?" he asked, kindness wrapped in mischief. "We can," Ross said, letting the offered hand add a 3rd point to their geometry. "But we might not be very good at it." "Who needs good?" Wendy said, allowing herself to be pulled gently upright. "We have practice." They rose. The room clapped again, smaller now, warmer, as if everyone had agreed that this ridiculous, luminous, low-angle joy was the part they wanted to take home and hold up to their own kitchens, their own hallway floors, their own Tuesday arguments. On the edge of the dance floor, Ross tested his footing like a sailor reacquainting himself with land. He squeezed Wendy's hand and felt it squeeze back in a pulse that matched his own. The trio, sensing the end of their small miracle, slid into something soft and blue. Conversation resumed its civilized shimmer. A server rescued an orphaned spoon. The chandeliers pretended they had not lowered themselves to watch. He leaned in until his forehead touched hers. Their breath mingled, the shared climate of people who have learned one another's weather. "There'll be more falls," he said, not as an omen, just as a weather report. "There will," she said, "but we'll laugh, or cry, or both, and then we'll dance. And we'll forgive. And we'll forgive." They stood like that for a while, 2 of the least graceful people in Chicago, and New York as of tonight, learning how to be graceful together, which turned out to be something different than they had been taught. Grace wasn't a set of lines you held without shaking. It was a willingness to move through the shaking without letting go. Later, much later, after congratulations and soft teasing, and 3 separate people asking for the name of her tailor, she grinned and said, "Me." They found the terrace. The city sharpened their lungs with cold. Steam rose from grates like good stories. Taxis threaded their needles along the dark cloth of avenues. Wendy leaned on the stone balustrade. Ross stood beside her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on her back where the lace of the dress met skin. The music from inside thinned to a ribbon that slipped under the door and tied itself around their wrists. "I kept your photo," he said, eyes on the city. The license. I couldn't throw it away. I still have yours, she said. It lived in my nightstand like a superstition. He smiled. We've been carrying each other's names for months. And tripping over them, she said, and then she laughed again, the good laugh, the one that made small knots inside his chest loosen and vanish. We'll still trip, he said. We will, she answered, and turned to him and kissed him, not for the room or the story or the way light behaves around such moments, but because kissing him felt like the most honest version of standing still she knew. They went back inside eventually. They said their goodnights and accepted their last compliments and made their way to the lobby where a night guard looked up and tried and failed not to smile at the sight of two very careful walkers holding hands as if their fingers were learning a waltz. In the glass doors they were reflected, him and her, and behind them a faint ghost image of a couple mid-dip, as if the evening were unwilling to close without keeping one more copy of what it loved. They stepped through the doors, and the reflection broke, and then remade itself on the next pane and the next. Outside, the winter air kissed their cheeks with clean teeth. The city kept its own rhythm, a deeper bass line under human music, a reminder that balance is not stillness, but motion discovered and rediscovered. They began to walk, slowly, because slow felt like praise. Half a block later, the sidewalk offered up a wobble where a tree root had heaved the slab. Ross felt the old ripple of dread and then, almost in the same moment, its companion, humor. He tightened his arm around Wendy. She let her weight tip toward him. Together they stepped over. Look at us, he said. Champions, she said. Of what? Of the possible. They did not fall, or rather they did 3 days later, and 2 weeks after that, and once in a hardware store aisle because a display hook understands gravity better than most philosophers. Each time they laughed or cried or both, and each time they forgave, and each time when there was music, they danced. And if you had looked at them that New York night, there on the ballroom floor, lying on polished wood with tears in their eyes and their hands clamped together as if the building might slide and carry one away, you would have understood what the room understood, what the band understood, what the two of them were only then beginning to learn. The curse had been misnamed. It was not clumsiness. It was a fate that insisted on being shared.